Good afternoon. My name is Colonel Ryan Johnson. I'm the Fires OC with Operations Group Charlie. I've been with the program for just about 3 years now, and I'll give you just a tiny bit of my background just so you understand where I'm coming from and what my experiences are, because that'll help frame, my perspective and what I'm giving to you here. So, prior to coming back to MCTP, I did my KD time in the 25th, and I had the opportunity to be a division fire support officer, and then a adjutant chief for 2 warfighters, actually in the seat during the exercise. And then, of course, I come here, and we're doing, we've done 12, 15 warfighters in these past 3 years, and every time I basically coach and teach and mentor the adjutant and the division fires element. So that has become, for better or worse, in the past 5 years of my life, my focus area. So I tell you that up front simply to say that I've had a lot of experience in that realm. If I gloss over anything, or skip stuff that you want me to talk in more detail about, please just raise your hand, let me know. I don't try to brush through things, but a lot of stuff I've just said and heard it quite a bit myself, so I tend to skip some things. All right, so that said, you got me for this block of instruction right now. So this dialogue we're going to have on dynamic targeting, and then tomorrow morning we're going to talk deliberate targeting as well. So it's going to be kind of fluid, so whatever topics come up, we're just going to take the conversation that way, and between this afternoon and tomorrow, we will make sure we cover all the major points. And I'm going to try to focus this, I was telling the fires commander about this, I'm going to try to focus this almost strictly on what trends that we see out of divisions when they go through warfighters, the things they struggle with, the areas they have challenges, and then things for us as OCs to look for. Indicators of areas that they're struggling with, and then things to coach them on to get them better. Like Colonel Manor mentioned in the beginning, this is really all about how we get our training audiences better and kind of move the ball down the field a little bit. So with that, if you guys could go to 2 left, 3 right. All right, so as I mentioned, the agenda today, this afternoon, we're going to cover the first bullet, the battlefield architecture, simply because we've brought it up a couple of times before. And then we'll talk about our transition, how we get things out of the formal targeting process into the current ops fight. And then we'll talk about dynamic targeting. The rest of that stuff we'll cover tomorrow morning. All right, so 4 left, 5 right. All right, so, and I'm going to move around. I apologize for the camera guy. I think better and I speak better when I'm moving. So we always show this to our division training audiences right up front because it's really the biggest issue that people have, is figuring out this question, whose fight is it? And we talked to a little bit about the operational framework earlier, and that was more through the movement and maneuver lens of things, so we're looking at it through the fires lens now. This quad chart, these guys will correct me if I'm lying, but we usually spend about 20 minutes just listening to general officers and division primary staff pontificate about what this means to them. What I'll describe to you is simply that divisions oftentimes struggle in assigning roles and responsibilities and maintaining focus on the various different parts of the fight because they haven't had a conversation up front about who owns each of these quads, and then more importantly, how those quads interact with each other. So the easy ones are right down here. Everybody tends to agree that CHOPS is your person that owns the current ops fight, which everybody agrees with. The deep fight, the deep current fight, is your adjutant chief, and that's the dynamic targeting piece. So they are prosecuting what's happening forward of the division, how they're setting conditions for their brigades. Where things get in a little bit a little more challenging is when you look at these top 2 blocks. The relationship between your deep future fight, which we characterize as the targeting effort, the deliberate targeting piece, usually headed up by your D-Fiscord, and then basically your future planning, your G35 and your 3 and your 5 shot. That relationship, how they discuss future maneuver plans in relation to future shaping efforts, and then how all of that is communicated between the quads is one of the biggest challenges that units experience. So I would offer to you as OCs, use this as a tool when you go in and you're looking at an organization. Keep that in the back of your mind to understand how they have framed who owns which part of the fight, and then more importantly, how information flows in between. Okay?
Can you do two things?
Yes, sir.
One, kind of compare, so a lot of folks have experience with targeting, but in a different context.
Okay.
So if you can kind of compare and contrast a little bit, targeting in the sense of a lot of folks experience OIF, OEF, and targeting in a large-scale combat operation, which methodology is similar, but fundamentally it's different.
Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. So targeting itself, the Army subscribes to the decide, detect, deliver, assess methodology, the D3A model that everybody's familiar with. And there's other models out there. They use the find, fix, finish, etc., all the other ones. And really all those are, they essentially do the same things for the most part. It's just a mental framework to make sure you hit all the steps and you've accounted for everything. Now targeting in coin versus targeting in large-scale combat operations, the biggest point of departure is what you're targeting. Oftentimes in coin, you are looking at individuals, you're looking at terrorist cells, you're looking at these human networks and how these things are interrelated. In large-scale combat operations, you are primarily focused on removing the enemy's critical capabilities. So when your planners, or when the 28th planners, they go through and they try to figure out the big blue arrows on the map, they're going to run into friction with your coalition of forces. So they're going to look at the COFLMs and they're going to say, hey, we cannot take this objective based on how much we think the enemy's going to have on set objectives, so we need to reduce some of their enablers, to set the right conditions. So targeting in large-scale combat operations is more focused on those enemy formations and capabilities, which is what really translates when we do our MDMP. Those are high-value targets because they're critical for the enemy commander to accomplish their mission. They turn into high payoff targets when we decide that it's something we need to remove from the battlefield to set those conditions, if that answers your question.
The other thing is because that battlefield architecture kind of helps define who is responsible for what. It may help to kind of describe a little bit about what that looks like. So like deep future is probably concerned with IADs because that might be what I'm going to kill 72 hours, 48 hours from now. But I've got to kill it, I've got to be able to see it and kind of vector my maneuver forces in to get there. And so the assets that can do that generally have to fly into an air defense bubble as an example. So the things I'm worried about in deep future far are going to be different than deep future close. I'm using a little bit of deviating already from the chart, but in deep current, it's going to be still a different one. And then I'm stripping away enemy capabilities to make the fight manageable for the brigades. In other words, we're shaping the fight. So kind of who's responsible for what, and if something, where does the Corps' responsibility end, the division responsibility begin, and how we're shaping that fight?
Yes, sir. So generically speaking, and this, of course, it's always dependent on the situation, the enemy, everything else. Typically, what divisions will do from their out to their coordinated fire line, which this should also read your brigade forward boundary, is the close current fight. And that is usually set, and if you can go back to 5 on the left, you can see some of the ranges put on, but essentially, not to bounce around, we'll keep it generic here. This is usually set out to whatever the direct support battalions for those brigades can range out to. So whatever their organic assets can hit, the division should be setting their CFL somewhere in that area. Everything short of that is the close current fight. You go beyond that, and you're between the CFL and the FISL, so basically from the brigade forward boundary out to the division forward boundary, roughly, that is your deep fight. And that is where the division spends the majority of their effort, the majority of their resources, and that is their bread and butter, is trying to set those conditions, because as your boss mentioned, what happens here 24 to 48 hours later is then this. And so there's a time element as well to the understanding the who's fight and the aspect, this concept of deep. It's not just geographic, but there's a time element. Someone mentioned it previously. I think we were talking about time distance analysis and understanding that if we're moving at a certain rate of speed, the enemy, or we'll be within range of the enemy at a certain time. So it's not just looking geographically and saying, I want to be about 20 kilometers out to my CFL because that's what we can range at the brigade level, and I want to be about 45 kilometers out to the FISL. It's the time aspect as well, because if you have an enemy formation that's moving out of the deep future quadrant and coming down here, but they're moving faster than we anticipate, and they're going to be into this fight sooner than anticipated, that's something we have to account for. I know that was a lot. Does that make sense? Or, okay. And what I'll caution you with here is, if the 28th is not very careful and conscious of how they carve out their battle space, and it's not a deliberate decision, it's something that's handled in planning up front, oftentimes we see units where they haven't accounted for every inch of the battle space. And what that'll end up doing is it'll turn into this kind of like gelatinous, amorphic blob of a battlefield. And then the people that are executing the current deep fight, that JADG chief is sitting up there. If they don't have perfect visibility about who owns what space, it will slow down their clearance process for fires. It'll grind it to a halt. And then we can bring it up now, sir, if you want. Go ahead and just do 22. Bring it up on the right here, please. It's a little bit clearer. You're going to lose lethality. This is a model that we've used for about the past year now as a way to describe to units what it takes to get effects in the deep fight. And it's these three things. We have to be timed with our fires, we have to be accurate, with sufficient mass in order to kill the enemy. Right? A big part of the timeliness, and one of the things that really hinders divisions, is the air clearance and the ground clearance piece. And that is directly correlated back to our depth of planning and our structure for the battlefield framework. Okay? I would also offer to you that this model, the lethality equation as we call it, those three pieces, should be something that you can take with you. And when you're looking at their plan for the deep fight, whatever they're expecting to do, and how they integrate, synchronize with their party or fab to accomplish those effects, if they haven't accounted for being able to shoot quickly with good accuracy and with sufficient mass, then their plan is probably not going to pan out for them the way they want it. And likewise, with whatever your team, I'm assuming it's one of the folks back there in the corner, is assigned to coach the division JADG. If they aren't getting effects in the deep fight, pull this model back out and ask them, use it as a troubleshooting guide to say, look, man, what's holding you up? Oftentimes it's in the clearance piece, sometimes it's the collection plan is not synchronized, and sometimes we're shooting back with insufficient number of rounds to achieve the effects based on the target type we're looking for. So, I don't want to belabor the battlefield framework piece. If there's more you want me to touch, sir, I certainly can go on. Okay. All right, so...
we'll defer to anybody else that has questions, so I'm not the only one that can ask them here.
That's right. All right, so moving out of the battlefield framework discussion, and really all this does over here is you have these slides for your reference. This just shows it's a pull out of 3-94. This just shows in a little more detail as opposed to the cartoon sketch that was up for future reference and coaching when you're working with the 28. So this was the first thing we wanted to hit was the battlefield framework. The next piece is our transition for how we get things out of the plans area, the targeting process. So if you can go to 16 both, please. All right, so our dialogue today, 16. So our dialogue today, like I said, we're talking mostly the dynamic piece, and that's everything that resides out on the COIC floor. The COIC needs some sort of a game plan. So if you are to use a sports analogy, because most of us probably are football fans in some way, your JADG chief is the quarterback. That individual is running the deep fight for the division. So what you see up here is a product that a lot of units are producing nowadays, a lot of divisions are using, where it's a mashup of everything that comes out of the deliberate targeting process. And this is really think of it as the offensive coordinator, the play sheet that they're holding up in front of their face while they're making the call as to what to do. So we will talk in much more detail tomorrow about the deliberate targeting process and how the division should synchronize all the warfighting functions to develop this play sheet to come up with their plan for the deep fight for the next 24 hours. But what it's important to hit on now, since the focus of this afternoon is the dynamic piece, is how do we get this plan, this framework that the JADG is supposed to be executing, out to them in a meaningful manner. Okay? The biggest trend that we've seen, and this has somewhat started to course correct over the past 2 years, is that plans were not making it out in a deliberate fashion, and a lot of information was being missed. So the division was, they were putting all this effort into their targeting process, and they were coming up with what they thought was a good solution for the problems in the deep fight, but they weren't getting it to the executors in a meaningful way. Through coaching, we've started to see some improvement in this. So first, let's talk about the product. They can produce whatever they want. This could be 4 documents, it could be 1 document, it could be, whatever the 28th wants to use, but the key components of it, I'll start right up front, is the very top left quadrant here. That JADGIC chief, in order to be successful, needs to understand in real words, usually a couple multi-sentences, what the commanding general wants to accomplish in the deep fight that day, for that period of time, right? What's key to this is not just describing what effects they want, which is good that they have the destruction right up here so they understand what they're trying to accomplish, but the specifics of the capability, and then also where that correlates on the map. Because we could kill a battalion's worth of enemy long-range artillery, but if we kill it too far deep where they wouldn't have been able to even affect us anyway, it's not relevant if we bypass, the artillery that is within range of us. So understanding the timing, the location, and then what the capability is critical. This type of a play sheet does that for them. So it'll tell them what to kill, and then in more detail, you'll see the division high payoff target list down here with specific numbers of how many of those systems they're looking to remove from the battlefield to get to the right COFMs, but also the location on the battlefield. And this is what really helped me when I was a JADGIC chief. Now the next thing as you go down is this synchronization chart down here. The benefit of doing this is it helps not just show the lethal assets and where we want to apply our lethal capabilities, but you can see, you'll be able to see on the digital copy when you pull it up on your laptop. But this line here says SEMA, and there's other non-lethal assets tied to this. What this will help do is provide awareness for that JADGIC chief, all the things that have been coordinated for on the non-lethal side that'll enhance the effects of their lethal efforts, right? And what this will do, you can correlate the different colored boxes here. So everything in this tan colored box, whether it's lethal or non-lethal, corresponds to this area on the map. So again, it does not matter what product the 28th wants to use. What matters is that all the information is there, and that it is a plan that they can put into action for the division. Okay, before I go on, are there any questions specifically to this and how we transition things out from the targeting process into the website?
Just one quick comment, and Don, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's our understanding the 28th doesn't intend to have a JADGIC cell for their emergency exits.
Okay.
And I don't, is that accurate still? That's what we're hearing anyways.
Okay.
And I'm just curious, maybe at some point throughout your brief, you could, help us coach them, as to why they're making that decision. Of course, that's really not my
It's
fault.
interesting. Have they mentioned anything about what they plan on doing then, if they're not utilizing JET?
Not to me, but
Okay.
they're not built that way. I mean, I got it, but who are they going to go ask for the support from, sir? I mean, that's the question.
But some of that comes down to
Their fires guys are going to be the guys who pretend to be the JADGIC as well, right? Like they have the same dudes. But it's not, they struggle with it. The Vardis are built in National Guard to help assist with this, but they're not linked in with that CPS. Exactly.
Okay. Just go 17 minutes, please. We'll get into it right now. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the JADGIC itself is comprised of Army and Air Force, right? Everybody understands that. So there is an agreement that's been made several years ago. The division is the unit of action for the Army. The Air Force, to get after air-ground integration, has agreed that they're going to put in an ASOS with every division to form what they call the Joint Air-Ground Integration Center, right? So that's where we're at. So the Army personnel that populate the Army half of the JADGIC come out of your division fire cell, for the most part, your G3 aviation cell, and then sometimes, depending how they want to array, you'll pull some folks out of the G2 cell. Sometimes units pull forward their FMV assets and sit them on the kill table. It's just different techniques. So the 28 should have the requisite people to fill out the Army portion of this just out of their division FSE. And I was with them, is it 21-2? I think it was 21-2. I came as an augmentee and I coached them and I worked with their JADGIC specifically. So I can talk to the issues that they had. They had an ASOS with them. I don't remember the nomenclature or which unit that was or where they came from. But they had an ASOS in the room, but their big challenge was that they were not well integrated. So if you can envision it, within their COIC, they were somewhat centrally located, which is good. That was all fine. The Army was on one side of the tent, and then there was about a 10-foot alley between them, and then the Air Force was on the other side. Big issues with integration and synchronization and the effectiveness of it. So they were integrated at that point when they did that warfighter. I don't know what their plans are for the CPX. But they have enough Army people to replicate it. And as Mr. Jaskowitz mentioned earlier, there are ways that you can replicate the Air Force piece of it for the actual CPX. And we can talk to in just a couple minutes here when we get over to the delivery assets. Over here, I'll talk more about what the Air Force brings to the deep fight and how it should be integrated, and then we can talk potentially about ways to get around that if they're not playing in the CPX. Does that answer a little bit of the tension that will exist there?
All of this tension is just, they're fighting their deployment manning document for OSS, and they're coming in 500 plus strong, so they made a conscious decision not to come in with the JAGIC. But for the folks that are covered down on the fist war, the fires folks, read that top sentence, because that function still has to occur within the division staff, regardless if I have a fully manned JAGIC or whether I've got to take it out of hide and use other personnel for it. And so our challenge is to kind of help coach them into seeing themselves and understanding what loss of capability that they have by not bringing their JAGIC and how they're going to replicate it. We're already kind of thinking through those. I just don't know what the edge on the far side is going to be. We'll have CTX 1 and 2 sort of explore that and figure it out.
Yes, sir. All right, so I'll talk this through somewhat in number sequence just because this is where a lot of the coaching points that would be useful for you to work with the 28th will reside is on this slide. So we started to talk about the physical location of the JAGIC. So first thing to look for anytime I go in and I coach an organization is just what their ergonomics look like, their physical setup and their command post. I am a strong believer that the JAGIC should be either dead center in the COIC or very close to it. That is the focus. Colonel Payne put it up on his slide right away, the 5 things the division is responsible for doing. Setting conditions was the first thing on that list. So by centering the JAGIC in the division COIC, you keep that focus on that responsibility. Because that's the agency that's going to be doing it for you. Within the JAGIC itself, ergonomics matter tremendously. So I mentioned with the 28th last time, they had this alleyway between the Army and the Air Force. It may as well have been a 10-foot wall. It sounds a bit silly and a bit dramatic, but any physical separation slows down the effectiveness of communication tremendously. So what I'd like to see, the first thing to look for is where is the JAGIC chief positioned? I'm a proponent that they should be somewhere centered on the table so they can actually communicate without shouting to everybody on the table. They should be close proximity to either the TACP or your senior air director, their Air Force counterparts, basically. Now, granted, if the 28th doesn't bring that to this, then obviously we'll work around that. But they need to be tied in closely with those individuals. And then I also like to have them very close to, or at least being able to see the airspace managers. So there's an Army, the TAES operator, and then on the Air Force side, there's an airspace manager. Usually those two folks are sitting side by side, so we can see both the green air picture and the blue air picture, and they can communicate quickly. And then for me as a JAGIC chief, I need to be able to have them spin their screen around or be able to look at what their picture is, because the TAES will show you the 3-dimensional picture of what the airspace currently looks like. So when you're figuring out the dynamic fight, that's one of the biggest hindrances, so I needed to make sure I could communicate with them quickly. So JAGIC to your senior air director, JAGIC to your airspace managers are the critical links within the JAGIC itself, right? And then they can figure out the rest of the communication amongst them, how they're going to make it flow as efficiently as possible. External to the JAGIC, within the COIC itself, though, there's a triangle of 3 really important people that need to be communicating more or less constantly throughout the day, multiple touch points, and that is your JAGIC chief to your CHOPS, as well as your JAGIC chief to the G2 rep that's on the floor. So I would encourage, again, the 28th to have this figured out, this triangle of people, so we can have these mini huddles throughout the day, because what you'll see is that there is always going to be a difference between what if you remember the quad chart that we had up there, the JAGIC owns the deep current fight, CHOPS owns the close current. Those two individuals, if they're not talking periodically throughout the day, their assessment of what's going on is going to be divergent. And they're going to have these different pictures in their mind of what's actually happening. And if they're not talking to the G2 rep on the floor, who is painting the picture of what is currently happening with the enemy, those assessments are all going to be divergent, and they're not going to be helping the division understand truly what's happening right now. So the 28 can figure out how to co-locate those individuals in close proximity to each other to have those conversations. Their assessments will improve. Therefore, their targeting effort, their targeting working groups and boards will improve. They'll make better decisions, and they will come up with better plans for the deep fight moving forward. Once I look at the physical setup and the array of everybody and how the information is flowing between them, the next thing I look at is really if the division understands and is using all of the available target sources that are out there. The division has a lot of toys. Major Thomas talked about in his class all the things that reside in the intel community, that crazy slide with all the architecture up there that no one understood. All those things are ways for them to find targets to kill out on the battlefield, right? All of that usually resides within the ACE, which is a separate organization. It's detached from the COIC floor itself. But you have this individual, which he mentioned as well, the Field Artillery Intelligence Officer, which in my mind is one of the most important people in the division. That individual should be helping to focus the entirety of the ACE to keep them on task with hunting the things that we put up on that play sheet earlier. It's his job to keep them focused on the high payoff target list. It's his job to vet targets based on the attack guidance matrix. It's his job to make sure all of these different ints that are out there, your SIGINT, your GMTI, your ELINT, everything else, all the tremendous power of the ACE is being harnessed and focused towards that shaping effort. And if they have not thought through exactly how you're going to pull in all these different ints and then synchronize and integrate the information into actual targets and then how those targets flow out to the JAGIC for execution, they're going to run into issues. So that's really the second part of the coaching, is figuring out, one, first the physical layout, two, the proximity of the ACE to the JAGIC itself, and then that FAO as the link between the two. Okay? Again, I know it's a lot of information and I don't want to gloss over stuff. Are there any questions on that before I keep going?
Does the FAO and the artillery officer?
He's a 131 Alpha targeting officer. Yep. Usually a CW2, sometimes a CW3, depending on manning. And it's honestly a point we see in a lot of the active duty divisions. They're short on personnel, so I think your M204, 131s up in the division fire cell. Sometimes units aren't fully manned. But I would argue that I would assume risk elsewhere, and I would put your best 131. Now your senior 131's running the targeting process, so they're consumed doing that. Your very next best 131 should be sitting right there as the FAO, keeping that link tight. All right, so now as we move down, the next thing we look at is the JAGIC's ability to leverage all of the different options that they have to them. So there's a handful of things that the division can do to kill things in the deep fight. There's obviously surface fires that's delivered by your DIVARTI or your FAB. They can leverage the aviation brigade in deep attacks or attacks out of contact or whatever we want to call it. So our rotary wing assets. You also have joint fires, which is everything that Big Blue brings to bear on the fight. And then you have typically Gray Eagles with the capability of arming them with Hellfires, which is another tool that they can bring to bear. What I'll speak to here on this bullet, it is common for divisions to be able to bring those options to bear one at a time. Most divisions start off with the ability to deliver surface fires somewhat efficiently. They're able to talk to the Air Force guys and vector in joint fires, and they can use their aviation brigade. What units are usually unable to do right and mask all of these effects on critical targets in a meaningful, synchronized manner. And that really is the gradual level that we're trying to get units to. So the typical evolution, and this is what I was just called, is the evolution of a JADGIC. I'll go in and you'll see them for the first 2 days of the warfighter. They will strictly be looking at the targets that come in that are presented to them, so they'll be in a reactive mode. They'll see that, a 9 Alpha 5 2 was identified in this area. They'll look at their attack guidance matrix on their play sheet, and they'll say it's going to be a joint fire solution. They'll hand it off to the TAC P, and they'll go and kill it. And then some other target indicator will pop up, and they'll pass it off to the Nori or FAB to shoot. And it's not efficient enough to just be playing whack-a-mole like that. And it usually takes 3 to 4 days before they start seeing the big pictures, and they stop looking at individual targets in a reactive mode, and they start seeing those as indicators, things that have popped up. So we now got an indicator that there's an artillery formation in this area. Okay, maybe I'm going to hold on that. See another indicator of more artillery in that area. Maybe you see some air defense in that same area. Now you start seeing the bigger picture. And they'll start to be able to see that, if there's artillery and air defense there's probably something else. Maybe there's protection assets. Maybe there's a maneuver element nearby as well that the enemy's posturing for some nefarious activity. You'll stop seeing things as individual targets, and you'll start seeing them as problem sets. And that's really where you want to live as a JADGIC. If you are being reactive and simply responding to what the enemy shows you, you're not going to be effective enough. And you're certainly not going to be massing all these delivery options to wipe out formations at a time. You'll still just be plinking individual targets. So conceptually, it's a mindset shift that they have to get to. Okay. So number 5, I started to talk about this, and we'll hit this in much greater detail tomorrow, is the targeting process itself. That'll go through a bit of foreshadowing here. We'll talk through how the division needs to integrate all their warfighting functions, how they need to integrate their assessments to come up with a deliberate plan for the deep fight for the next 24, 48, 72 hours. And then the process of requesting assets, and then how we refine those requests throughout the days. What I'll speak to this afternoon on this slide here, though, is that everything the JADGIC should be doing should be focused by the targeting process, because that's what the commander blessed off on in the targeting board. That was what the agreement was. These are my targeting objectives. This is what I need you to focus on. What's important, and we started to talk about this a little bit earlier, is how this plan gets out to the JADGIC. We talked about the content of it. The timing and who's involved is also important. So that's the next thing I look at when I'm most seeing the JADGIC is, when do they bring that plan out? Who's involved in that handoff? And then is there truly understanding between everybody that needs to understand as far as what the plan is for that day? What's the current high-path target list? What's our target focus areas? What does the commander want us to kill to set those conditions? Now, just by way of recommendation, what I typically advocate for is that the DFIS court personally be the one to bring out the updated products and brief the incoming JADGIC chief as far as what the current plan is, and have the FAO there as well. If you bring those 3 individuals in, you can ensure that the intelligence side of it, the FAO understands the plan and what we're looking for, the execution arm, as well as the originator of the plan, are all on the same sheet of music. So, for what it's worth, that's what I see works well, as far as getting the plan out to the JADGIC for execution. Now, if you go back to 22, we put over here on the right place. We talked earlier the lethality equation, right? We mentioned that the clearance piece is one of the biggest hindrances to timely fires, and therefore effects in the deep fight. Number 6 here is really what the nexus of that is. More often than not, units have not developed a complete and feasible airspace plan that enables the rapid delivery of fires. So there's been some progress made. The unit airspace plans that we've been seeing have been improving a little bit over time, but they're still not where they need to be. So this will definitely be a coaching point and an area to work with the 28th on is how do you develop in the targeting process and in the planning process a good visualization of where we're going to be conducting our shaping operations and understanding of all the airspace users, and we'll talk this in much more detail in a breakout session tomorrow, of how to develop an airspace plan that's feasible. But units struggle with this, and I will tell you that their plans cause significant issues when we get to the JADG. One specific place in here that really highlights this is the counter-fire fight. So more often than not, the enemy fights with fires. For those that don't know, in the large scale fight, they are very fire centric. They'll kill 90% of us through their long range artillery. So we will inevitably be involved in this large counter-fire fight, more or less throughout the duration of the warfighter itself. So what will end up happening is that we won't have a good plan going into it. So when Major Thomas was talking about reverse IPD and having the artillery folks help shape the plan for understanding where the enemy artillery is going to be shooting from, units typically don't have a good process for that. So we won't have templated feasibly where we think the enemy is going to be shooting at us from. And we therefore won't have built-in airspace for our counterfire shooters to utilize to shoot back rapidly. And when you look at the entire chain that it takes to get reactive counterfire on target, it just takes way too long if you have any ground or air clearance involved in that at all. Because there's the acquisition time. So if the enemy's shooting at us with 9 Alpha 5.2s, they're longer range shots, it's likely that based on the time of flight and the ranges they're shooting from, we won't even acquire and understand that they've shot at us for the first 30 seconds. Then it's a decision, and as the mission gets routed up, so there's processing time, maybe another 20, 30 seconds before it gets to any sort of a decision maker. Someone will put their fingerprints on it, and they'll sit and think about it for a few more minutes and decide what they're going to do about it. And then eventually it's going to get back down to the shooter, and it's going to be over at the fab, and they're going to be excited because they got from the time they received the mission, they sent it down to their launchers. It was only another 45 seconds. And before you know, it's been a 6-7 minute long process. And when you look at the WEG and the Worldwide Equipment Guide and how the Op 4 fights and everything Major Thomas was talking about, their displacement times are 4 minutes or less. So if there is any amount of air clearance or ground clearance involved in reactive counterfire, I can promise you the 28 won't get effects. This goes back to understanding and properly templating with an event time where we think the enemy long-range shooters are. If you could just bring up 18 on the left, please. If we can template where the long-range shooters are in our planning process, we're going to know where we have to be able to range those. So we can plan in our own PAAs there, and we can block out what these are. These gray boxes are just goalposts, which is a ROS over top of the position airspace hazard, which is where we're shooting from, and a ROS over top of the target airspace hazard, which is where the rounds are going to be coming back down through the airspace into. And then this block over here, this is just the goalpost laid on its side. This is a ROS row of restricted operations area that accounts for the upper part of the trajectory. We can build these pre-planned in the ACO, the airspace control order, so that once we identify we get the first acquisition out of this area from Call for Fire Zone 1, if we have pre-built this, the DVARTI can tell us, yeah, we just got this acquisition. JADG through the ASOS can activate that goalpost, and then every single acquisition after that, DVARTI can shoot without any further coordination until we turn that airspace coordination measure off. The point of it being is there is a level of planning and detail and feasibility that needs to happen, which we'll talk about more in the breakout sessions and tomorrow. But that has to be part of the plan that we hand off to the JADG for execution. Okay, now there's an element, if General Longo is here, he would call me on it, saying that there's got to be some sort of response from us, which will trigger the enemy to stop shooting, to make them move, because if they're moving, they're not shooting at us, which is a very valid point. What I would offer when we're coaching their fires team is that if we know we have to call the JADG for air clearance, we should probably reduce that fire order so we're not wasting rounds. We know they're not going to have lethal effects on them. So maybe there should be a standard fire order for reactive counter fire when we have to conduct air clearance, and a different, much larger fire order when we know that we have the air clear and we can shoot back immediately. So just something to think about. And again, we will cover this in painstaking detail if you want me to tomorrow in the breakout session of how you build this entire plan out. So if you just go back to 17 vote, please. Okay, we're getting close on time, and I want to leave some time, obviously, for your OCs to ask questions, because that's, I think, where the most value comes from in this. So the final piece, really the final piece I want to touch on here is that the JADGIC should have a role in the assessments process. I alluded to it a little bit earlier. They will have the clearest picture of what's going on in the deep fight at any given moment, whether they know it or not. And then through dialogue between the CHOPS and the G2, if that communication is happening freely and frequently, they will understand when things are divergent, whether it's the event temp and the enemy's doing something that the G2 did not anticipate, or whether it's CHOPS and we are either on or off plan on the maneuver side, and how that correlates with the shaping efforts. So, real time, we need to understand that JADGIC chiefs, that division fire element needs to understand what the plan is, maneuver, what we think the enemy's going to be doing, and as well as what the shaping efforts are looking like. And if they can have that dialogue and they can understand it, they can be the ones to help trigger division RDSP, which Colonel Payne talked about a little bit earlier. We need to know, bottom line, whether we're on or off plan, and they are one major piece in that cause. Now, the other thing that they can offer back is feedback into the targeting process. So they get the plan every day. They have that play sheet. Sometimes, sometimes you go 3 and out, and the plan doesn't work the way you thought it would. You might need to go back to the offensive coordinators and let them know that running option right 3 times in a row isn't working. We got to change up the plan. So their feedback into the targeting process is valuable, and it's often a missing link in what the division does. And there's one other piece as well. There is usually units get to the point where there is a large flow of targets coming out of the ACE through the FAO, more so than the JADGIC can actually handle. So you might get it not uncommon to receive 600 acquisitions a day in a warfighter at a large scale operation. You're certainly not going to be able to prosecute all of those and respond back to every single one of them. Likewise, there's lots of other target indicators that come in that you just don't have the assets or time to get to. What we rarely see, though, is that feedback coming back from the JADGIC chief into the FAO, saying, yeah, I acknowledge that you sent me this SA-17 or this whatever. I don't have anything for that. You need to further develop that as a target. So oftentimes, things that are sent out to the JADGIC, the ACE just assumes they were actioned on it. And then lo and behold, 15, 18, 24 hours later, they find out they weren't. And we didn't keep eyes on that target, we didn't keep tracking it, we didn't keep developing that for future action. So that's another big gap in the swing, is they owe feedback not only to the targeting process to help develop better plans for the next day, but also to the ACE and the intel community as to what they're actually actioning and what effects they're getting. On the Air Force side, which they may or may not be playing in this, there's the munitions effectiveness assessments. They need to understand what weaponeering they're putting on their planes and the effects that it's getting on their targets and the things we're sending them in there. All right, so I think we got about 10 minutes left for questions. If you go to 20 both, please. And again, the questions and dialogue part of this is really where we're going to make our money. So I'll just leave up on the screen while we're having any follow-on conversations here is just some of the overarching lessons that we have seen, and this is what we usually leave the division training audiences with as far as things they can do to be successful. First, which we've talked about already and we'll hit more tomorrow, how do we develop a complete plan for the deep fight? How do we hand that plan off to the JADGIC, leveraging the FAO and the power of the ACE? And then the assessments piece that is often overlooked because everybody looks at the JADGIC as being a dynamic execution arm, and they're often forgotten when it comes to assessments and feedback. So with that, I'll open it up to the floor.
Yes, that targeting, for lack of a better term, that targeting worksheet, that methodology that you laid out earlier.
16.
Yeah, so does that get published after the target decision board and the targeting criteria comes out? Is that where that should be produced so that that gets handed off to the
Absolutely.
judge? Is that?
Yep, so this is just a mashup of multiple different products. So this could take, a unit could choose to use this format if they want. They could also just have a separate freestanding high payoff target list. They could have a separate attack guidance matrix, target synchronization matrix, etc. But all of this needs to absolutely go through the orders process. So after the targeting board, it's not uncommon that there's a 2-hour lag for people to make the finish, tying up the products, and then it gets published in order. And while we're on this, the one thing I'll tell you is that the only thing that isn't listed on this slide that we talked about is the airspace plan. So this physically shows everything else, but there has to also be a good handoff for what the targeting process develops and what the planners put together for the airspace plan to the JAGIC as well, so they know what tools they're working with, and what airspace has been pre-coordinated for, if that helps.
Yeah, can you just comment, I mean, I know our purpose for the next 3 days is to just get some education so we can better prepare the 28th ID. So much of what you just talked about is not taught in our trade-off branch founding courses. This is not taught in flight school, it's not taught in prep course, it's not taught in ILE or AOC. Yet we come in and we need to coach, teach, and mentor people. I'm just curious, how much of this you've learned since you've been in MCTP?
So, and that's part of why Colonel Manner has always put me against teaching JAGICs, because I've just been unique and lucky in that I've done it twice in a warfighter, and I've learned a lot. And then, the Army is starting to come around, and the Joint Force is starting to come around. So the Army Joint Support Team, based out of Pearl River Field, Florida, offers what they call the SJAT, Specialized Joint Airspace Training, I think is what it stands for. But that's the JAGIC training course. So that's offered several times a year. I can get you guys, if you want to pass it off to the 28th, their contact info. But that is really the only formal training that we have available to us. The rest of it is all this informal, experiential, just trying to transfer lessons learned as best as possible. So there's some other products I can help you guys with to try to pass the lessons. But really, the SJAT's the only formal course, and then learning by doing, warfighter.
Is the JAGIC codified in doctrine, or is it?
It is. Yes, sir.
Okay. How recent of a copy? I know I've seen it, but
Can you bring up 3 on the right? I just want to pull up the references slide. I don't want to speak up. 2019, sir. 3-91. That's the best we got. Now, the problem with all doctrine is it's a stepping off point. So it's somewhat generic in nature, and a lot of what we talked about, you're not going to figure out until you're in your division headquarters, until that group's together, and they work through all that friction together. And again, we just scratched the surface. I could talk about this for days if you want.
So just to give you a snapshot to answer your question. When we do academics and before we do academics, we have a conversation about the JAGIC. And when we do academics, we work on breakout on, best practices and TTPs for running the JAGIC. The problem is who's not there when we do that. Well, the train audience is, but the Air Force usually is not. So, you start to get the division into, okay, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to do it. They're having great conversations. And then, their Air Force brothers, our brothers in blue when they get there, are trying to fit within the construct of the building. Majority of those guys have been in the course, so correct. They'll put in the JAGIC, if not all of them. Every now and then there's a new guy that might not. So they know pretty much what to do. It's just the integration piece that sometimes is a little choppy, if that makes sense. But, if they're not going to a warfighter, and they haven't been to one in a little while, this is probably atrophied at the division level.
Absolutely. There's some hands over here.
So you're saying you notice that most of the time, about 72 hours into the fight, the JAGIC cell starts really being able to identify and see the way the battlefield is being shaped in a manner because of all that stuff coming in. So do y'all have a seat also, or would somebody from this JAGIC cell actually have a seat at the SEMA planning groups, or if they even have one. So, I mean, that
Yeah.
whole integration portion.
Yeah, no, yeah.
They're actually, because that's the thing that through all of our academics and through all the different things, you always miss out on that portion of it.
Yep.
And then, you know, the ability to affect it through EW and cyber.
Yeah, you're 100% right. So it gets back to the feedback portion. So from the JADGIC, their ability to collect what they're seeing and paint that picture, and then give that back to the other agencies to improve the planning or to adjust plans or refine targets or whatever. But no, they physically, the people that are on the JADGIC table, that's one of the hardest working, not to say that nobody else is working hard, but that is the most active cell in the division usually. Like it's exhausting. You'll be basically crunching and running through the process the entire shift you're in there. So the ability for a division to pull people off of that table to go firsthand and give that information elsewhere is really challenging. And stretches them really thin.
So before you have products given, that would be to the other working groups.
The best techniques that I've seen is having those folks stick around for 20, 30 minutes after their shift. One, to decompress, to put things into some sort of like logical sense in their own mind to be able to tell the story of what just happened. And then having them physically, when they're off shift, they've had a chance to breathe for a moment, go back and talk to their counterparts. So that JADGIC chief should do a good detailed handoff with his counterpart who's coming on shift, obviously. And then when he's done, he needs to go into the G2. He needs to go talk to everybody back in the ACE to make sure everybody's on the same page. He needs to go talk to the non-lethal folks, the deep fist corps, and basically make his rounds and say, yeah, this is where we're at, this is what we just saw, this is the most current information I have.
And so one last thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because of the level of what you're saying you're doing, the intensity of the fight that you guys are controlling, what in your mind would be the appropriate shift cycle? Is it 6, 12, 8?
It depends largely on manning.
Right.
Almost, so the Air Force side, if the ASOS comes, they are specifically designed to run 8-hour shifts. So they'll have 3 shifts within their cycle, and that's normal and fine, and they do a good job with it. The Army side, we usually don't have enough people for that. The best I've seen is just 2 12-hour shifts. When I first started doing it in 2017, we didn't have a second JADGIC chief, so there was no other major to pull up. So I just ran a 16-hour shift myself, which kind of bridged the high-intensity time of the fight. And I brought 2 of my warrant officers, 2 131s, it was a CW2 and a 3, to be my left-hand man right there on the JADGIC table. So they were doing all the vetting and validation. They were physically running the system, whether it's JDOCS or CPOF or how it integrates with AFATADS, all of that. They were the one receiving the targets in. They would occasionally ask me, hey boss, this is what we're seeing, is this good? Like, yeah, that's fine, we'll stay on plan. And then that allowed me as the JADGIC chief to take a step back physically to stand up and oversee the entire process, the entire table, rather than being stuck directly into my computer screen and running my specific part of the system. Doing that was a necessity because I had to sleep at some point, so I would come off shift, those guys would run the systems. Everything ended up working out pretty well. It was rough for a while until we figured it all out, but you're not going to see much better than 12 to 14-hour shifts, honestly, for that crew.
Then you had like all the normal weapon system, or normal efficient command system that you guys have in a cell. Are there any non-normal like this on the side, or any specific?
We usually didn't mess with any of the collateral damage estimation tools, so the piss off, decide, any of that other stuff, because given the nature of the fight, I'm not worried about weaponeering or doing any of the CDE calls for the most part. So as long as it doesn't violate non-target list entities, it's large-scale combat. I'm shooting back with large open sheaths, lots of fires, lots of as much destruction as we can bring. So a lot of that was eliminated and set to the side.
So from our perspective, the CTs coming in and seeing is going to be standardized. There's not going to be typically any uniqueness to it. It's going to be
There should be a ton. A lot of people have normalized now. So you'll have the fire support side of it. So you'll have your AFATADS and your effects management. I don't remember the newest name for it now. Whatever the old effects management tool was, but that system will be up right next to the AFATADS. You'll have your operators down there. And then on the green air side, you'll have your TAS and your AMNUs. Your airspace managers on the blue air side, they'll have all their own systems up. They'll usually bring their shelter, which has all of their like Link 16 systems and everything they need to do to communicate to your aircraft. But the biggest thing, some units use JDOCS based on if they're fielded or not, and some units don't. I personally, we were over in 25th ID, we got the bottom of the barrel equipment-wise, we were the last active duty folks to get upgraded on stuff, so I never had JDOTs. But it doesn't really matter. As long as you have a system and a process to get targets through quickly, and for everybody to have visibility on it, it's fine whichever one you use. But that's the biggest discrepancy that's out there. I will say, if you're coaching the JAGIC, for those in the room that'll be working with them, their ability, whether it's through JDOTs or CPOF or CPCE, to actively track the current problem sets that they're encountering, so that they can then hand them off to CHOPS or to the targeting team or whatever, is critical. And the way I did that, because I didn't have JDOTs, JDOTs does it really well. It plots it all for you. You can look at the correlations and the geography of it. I would simply just take those targets out of the, whether it was coming through, chat or any other system, I would drag and drop them onto a little sticky and it would populate on the CPOF map. And then I could label it by time and by capability of what enemy formation it was. So then an hour later, 2 hours later, someone comes by, I can tell the boss, yeah, we had this problem set emerge, this is what we put against it. We think this is an indicator of this that's coming next, et cetera, et cetera. So their ability, being a little bit long-winded, is their ability to paint the picture in a meaningful way is important. So they have to have some sort of a system figured out to do that.
Just to caveat on one thing you said too, this is from a C2 perspective. You asked about, or he had mentioned that TTP, having the chief, once he comes off shift, we won't talk and integrate into that. The planning cell as well is an area that, looking at co-ops informing the planning fight, said they're not desynchronized 2-3 days out as well. Entirely helpful TTP as well. So helping them coach onto that. And that doesn't go just for the JAGIC chief, it goes for kind of every functionality across the board. It's just something to help keep in mind. It's something to look out for and highlight best practice. Hey, the division did a really good job of this. It's always good to highlight those good things that the division staff is doing too.
All right.
So do you mind with the schedule?
If you have any other questions, again, we're doing this tomorrow morning. I'll be right back up here, so you can ask them
Thank you so much.
or grab me
Thanks for
after.
that.